The first sign of trouble was the sudden silence that swept across the battlefield. A moment before, the steady rhythm of boots crunching against dirt and the distant echoes of artillery had been the only sounds. Now everything was still. The men tensed, fingers tightening around their weapons, scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. The path ahead was a mix of thick undergrowth and uneven ground, a perfect place for an ambush. And then it came. The first explosion ripped through the line, sending bodies and debris flying into the air. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions, cutting down soldiers before they could react. Shouts of warning and pain filled the air, drowned out by the relentless hammering of enemy fire. The American troops, caught in the open, scrambled for cover, diving into the dirt, searching desperately for anything that could shield them from the deadly onslaught. The enemy had planned this moment well. They had waited until the advancing force had moved deep enough into the terrain, ensuring there was no easy way out. Mortar rounds crashed down with terrifying precision, hitting supply carriers, taking out communication teams, leaving the troops blind and disconnected. The radio crackled with frantic voices trying to reestablish control, but orders were lost in the chaos. Platoon leaders shouted for their men to hold their positions, but the front line was already collapsing under the weight of the attack. Some tried to push forward, hoping to break through the ambush before it was too late. Others fell back, seeking a new position to mount a defense. Neither option provided much hope. The enemy had the advantage, and they were using it mercilessly. A squad attempted to flank the machine gun nests that were tearing through their ranks, but the moment they moved from cover, they were cut down. The survivors pulled back, dragging the wounded with them. Blood mixed with dirt as medics worked frantically, knowing they had little time before the fight would reach them as well. Explosions rocked the ground, shaking the very air, filling it with smoke so thick that visibility was reduced to a few feet. The stench of burning flesh and gunpowder clogged their lungs, but there was no time to think about it. Every man knew what was at stake. If they could not hold their ground, they would be wiped out entirely. The situation was dire, but the soldiers refused to surrender. A heavy machine gun team set up behind the remains of a fallen tree, unleashing suppressing fire in an attempt to slow the enemy's advance. Riflemen took positions behind shattered boulders, picking off targets whenever they revealed themselves. Grenades were hurled blindly into the smoke, hoping to disrupt the unseen attackers. The battle turned into a brutal contest of endurance. Each second felt like an eternity as bullets whizzed past, barely missing their targets. The ground was littered with the dead and dying, but still, the fight continued. Some of the men ran out of ammunition and resorted to using their bayonets, engaging in hand-to-hand combat where every move determined survival. As the hours passed, exhaustion set in. The weight of their gear felt unbearable, sweat and grime mixing with blood as they struggled to stay focused. The enemy showed no sign of relenting, their movements disciplined, their attacks relentless. It became clear that this was not just an attempt to halt the American advance. It was an effort to annihilate them entirely. More men fell. The once steady line of resistance had fragmented, leaving isolated groups fighting their own battles across the ravaged landscape. Some soldiers never knew if reinforcements were coming, only that they had to keep fighting. The fear of being surrounded, of being completely overrun, loomed over them like a shadow. The radio suddenly crackled to life again. Reinforcements were on their way. The word sent a spark of hope through the surviving soldiers, but they knew it would take time for help to reach them. They had to hold out, had to buy every possible second, had to make sure there were still men left to save when backup arrived. A burst of energy surged through them. Machine guns rattled with renewed aggression, mortars were repositioned, and those who could still stand took up their weapons with determination. The ground beneath them was soaked with blood, the air still alive with the sounds of war, but they fought on. They had no other choice. Time stretched endlessly, but then, just as hope had begun to fade, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles signaled that relief was near. The enemy, sensing the shift in momentum, began to withdraw. The intensity of the attack lessened, the gunfire thinning as the ambush collapsed. The American soldiers had barely survived. They had been pushed to the very edge, held together only by sheer determination and luck. As they regrouped, tending to the wounded, collecting their dead. They understood just how close they had come to total destruction. The battle had been won, but at an immense cost. They had survived, but only just. The battlefield was still filled with smoke, the echoes of gunfire fading into the distance as the enemy pulled back. The surviving soldiers took a moment to breathe, but the relief was brief. Their bodies ached from exhaustion, their uniforms stained with dirt and blood. Many had lost their closest comrades. Men who had fought beside them moments ago now lay motionless in the mud. The ground beneath them was littered with discarded weapons, shattered helmets, and the remnants of an ambush that had nearly wiped them out. Though the enemy had retreated, the danger had not passed. The realization settled in. This was only a temporary reprieve. The ambush had left their unit weakened, their numbers reduced, and supplies running low. Ammunition had been nearly depleted during the fight, and food and water were scarce. Some men leaned against the remains of a fallen tree, gripping their rifles with shaky hands, their minds still locked in the chaos of battle. Others crouched beside the wounded, pressing makeshift bandages against open wounds, trying to stop the bleeding before it was too late. The medics worked relentlessly, their hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. Groans of pain came from every direction, but there was little time to tend to everyone. The worst of the injuries needed immediate attention, while others were patched up as best as possible before the march forward. Some men, barely able to stand, refused to be left behind. They pushed forward, ignoring the pain, knowing they had to keep moving or risk being overrun again. Scouts were sent ahead, cautiously moving through the trees, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. They had learned the hard way that the enemy could be waiting anywhere, hidden just beyond sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every broken branch, every shadow between the trees, was a potential threat. They moved with silent precision, rifles raised, fingers steady on the triggers. The enemy had not been fully driven away, only forced to regroup. They would return, and when they did, the soldiers needed to be ready. Orders came through the radio. They were to push forward, despite their losses. Reinforcements had not yet arrived, and the higher command needed them to secure the area before the enemy could recover. There was no time to question the decision. The soldiers gathered their gear, tightened their belts, and prepared to march. The weight of exhaustion sat heavy on their shoulders, but they knew there was no alternative. The terrain ahead was unforgiving, thick with foliage and uneven ground. Every step forward felt like a battle of its own, each movement a reminder of the bruises and wounds they carried from the fight before. Some men stumbled, catching themselves before falling. Others pressed forward without hesitation, their focus locked on the mission ahead. They had survived the ambush, but now they had to ensure they lived through what came next. As they moved deeper into enemy territory, signs of the battle remained all around them. Abandoned enemy positions, half-dug foxholes, and hastily discarded weapons marked the retreat of those who had failed to destroy them. The sight brought little comfort. It meant that the enemy had not been defeated, only delayed. Somewhere beyond the tree line, they were preparing for another fight, setting up new positions, waiting for the Americans to walk into another trap. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavier. The sound of boots pressing against damp earth echoed through the silence. Tension remained thick in the air, an unspoken understanding between the men that they were still walking the edge of survival. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the distant thud of an explosion. The enemy had begun their next attack. Bullets snapped through the trees, forcing the soldiers to dive for cover. Dirt and leaves scattered as they scrambled into defensive positions, returning fire with what little ammunition remained. The enemy had not retreated far. They had simply repositioned, waiting for the Americans to advance far enough before striking again. The battle reignited with renewed fury. The soldiers, though tired, fought back with everything they had left. They fired from behind fallen logs, used the land itself as their shield, and refused to let the enemy gain the upper hand. This time, they would not be caught off guard. This time, they were ready. As the firefight continued, one thing became clear. There would be no easy way out of this. They had barely escaped complete destruction once, and now they were being tested again. The war was unforgiving, and every moment of survival had to be earned. The only choice was to fight. The gunfire continued, echoing through the trees as the soldiers held their ground. The enemy had planned this assault well, striking again just as exhaustion had set in. Bullets snapped past, embedding themselves into tree trunks, sending splinters flying into the humid air. The men returned fire, their movements sharp despite the weight of fatigue dragging at their limbs. Every round fired had to count. There was no certainty of resupply. The terrain provided little protection. Some men huddled behind fallen logs, while others pressed themselves into shallow depressions in the earth, using whatever cover they could find. The enemy was well hidden, their position spread out, making it difficult to pinpoint their exact numbers. They had learned from a failed ambush and adjusted their tactics, refusing to let the Americans advance without a fight. A soldier crouched behind a thick root, his rifle aimed into the dense foliage. His breathing was heavy, the sting of sweat running into his eyes. He spotted movement ahead, just a flicker of motion in the trees, but it was enough. He squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of fire in that direction. A muffled cry followed, then silence. He didn't have time to process it. The fight was far from over. The radio crackled again, orders coming through in hurried bursts. A flanking maneuver was being organized, a desperate attempt to shift the tide of battle. A small group broke off, moving through the undergrowth, keeping low as they circled around the enemy's position. Every step forward was taken with caution, rifles raised, eyes scanning for signs of movement. The enemy was clever, but the Americans had no intention of walking into another trap. Gunfire erupted from the left flank as the maneuvering team opened fire, catching the enemy by surprise. The sudden shift in attack forced them to react, dividing their attention between the main force and the unexpected assault from their side. It was the opportunity the soldiers had been waiting for. Seizing the moment, they surged forward, using the confusion to close the distance. Grenades arced through the air, landing in dugouts and hidden positions, detonating with deafening force. The pressure was relentless, and the enemy, though skilled, began to falter under the intensity of the counterattack. The ground became a battleground of shifting control. Each side fought for inches, pressing forward only to be pushed back again. The smoke from the burning foliage mixed with the thick air, turning every breath into a struggle. The wounded lay where they had fallen, some still clutching their weapons, unwilling to give up the fight. One soldier, separated from his unit, found himself pinned behind a half-destroyed tree stump. The enemy fire was concentrated on his position, each shot sending dirt spraying into his face. He was out of grenades, his ammunition running low. He could hear his comrades pushing forward, but he was cut off, unable to move. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he made the decision. He had to run for it. With one deep breath, he sprang from cover, sprinting toward the nearest group of soldiers. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt at his feet. Just as he reached the safety of the line, a round struck his pack, sending him sprawling forward. Hands grabbed him, pulling him behind cover. A medic quickly checked him, finding only a torn strap, the bullet having missed him by inches. There was no time for relief. The fight wasn't over. The tide of battle began to shift. The enemy, once confident in their ambush, was now in disarray. Their defensive line had been weakened, their positions compromised. Some attempted to retreat deeper into the jungle, while others made desperate last stands, firing until they were overtaken. The Americans pressed harder, knowing that if they let up now, the fight would drag on longer than they could afford. The final moments were brutal. Every remaining enemy position was cleared, every pocket of resistance silenced. The ground was littered with the fallen, weapons discarded, magazines emptied. The smoke started to thin, revealing the extent of the destruction. The radio call finally came through. The area was secure. The soldiers, their bodies aching, their uniforms soaked with sweat and dirt, took a moment to process what had happened. They had nearly been wiped out twice in the same day, only to pull through by the narrowest of margins. They had survived, but just barely. As they regrouped, securing what little supplies could be salvaged, the weight of the battle settled over them. They knew this was only one fight in a long war. More battles lay ahead, more moments where survival would come down to instinct, strategy, and sheer will. They had won today, but tomorrow remained uncertain. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the field. The jungle, once alive with gunfire, had grown eerily silent. The war was not over, but for now, they had lived to fight another day.